So for the benefit of everybody who's watching this live, you have the opportunity of posing questions beneath my picture at the top right hand of your screen. You'll see a window that says Q&A, and you have an opportunity to write your questions or comments in that box. And at the end of the session, we will be able to answer your questions or respond to your comments. Obviously, if you're watching this as a recording, you can't do that. You've missed out the pleasure of doing that, but you will still hear the answer to other people's questions. And if at any time anybody watching a recording really has a burning question, I'm sure if you send me an email, I'd be delighted to answer it anyway, as would Richard, I'm sure. In fact, just for those of you who are watching at the moment, I mentioned where I am. Anybody who's joining this from any particularly interesting location, you can always practice putting comments into the Q&A box by putting a comment in by saying, yes, I'm sitting in bed, or I'm on the beach, or wherever you happen to be. Because we're in the world of remote working, which is why we're able to do this sort of thing, why Richard and I are indeed able to join you from our homes completely. I'm in Oxfordshire, he's in the west of London, and we're very happy to be able to share our views with you today. We're going to take about an hour to do it. I'm going to do 10-15 minutes intro. Richard will spend half an hour or so going through the meat of the webinar today. But there will be time at the end for you to pose your questions and comments. So far, I've only had one person comment on where they are, who's in his living room. That doesn't really count Michael as being very, very exotic location, but it illustrates the point that you can join from living rooms or anywhere. Okay, on to the main part of the presentation. And I just want to introduce by pointing out the obvious, I guess. As we look around us, we clearly can see that we are now in a world where there are thousands of smartphones, devices of all sorts that are here to provide us with, I don't know, sometimes technology that is really to aid us to do things the way we want to, sometimes actually a bit invasive. Is it not polite to have your mobile phone on the table at dinner and answer your emails or tweets or Facebook comments while still carrying on a conversation with somebody else? There's an older generation who thinks it's very rude and a younger generation who think it's perfectly natural. So we've got changes happening to the way we live our lives just because of mobile technology. And just one interesting statistic, there are now 83 million active mobile phones in the UK, which, if you stop and work out the statistics, is 130 phones for every 100 UK citizens, people of any age, which means an awful lot of people have got two or more mobile phones, one for work, one for pleasure, etc. And this is not untypical of other countries. I mean, even in China, it's has something like 90% penetration. So this is an illustration that these technologies, whether it's phones, tablets, laptops, and so on, have been around a long time, and they are changing the way we live our lives, and quite naturally, they're changing the way people want to work. They're providing just new views about what work is all about, where work fits into our lives. And the whole idea of work-life balance is becoming challenged almost, because that implies that there are two parts of life, sort of one's called work and one's called the rest of life, and somehow one has to balance those. What's actually happening is we're seeing a real blurring of the way that people work, so that you might be sitting with your smartphone on a wet Sunday afternoon answering emails. They could be personal emails, they could be work emails. You know, the whole idea of work being something you do at a fixed time in a fixed place is rapidly disappearing. And the technology as a catalyst has helped to break that down. But it's also would have happened, I guess, anyway, because there's a new generation coming through with new attitudes towards work, and who don't see why we have to work in fixed places, in fixed hours, in rigid organizations, when the world is much more flexible and agile. Why do we still have to have some of these old habits from the past? And flexible working, mobile working, agile working is not just now being seen as something that is a benefit for individuals. Now employers are seeing actually that obviously they can do things like save costs if they don't need as much office space because people don't travel in so much and they're hot desking when they come in. There are clear cost savings there. There's probably savings of costs on travel. You didn't have to travel to a conference center today to get the benefit of Richard's and my wisdom. And more important than that, though, is the fact that people can save time, effort, and stress in not commuting, which clearly means there's more productive hours available, some of which can be shared by the employer, some of which can be given to the employee's personal life. So it's a kind of win-win there potentially. But also, whilst people are working at a time and place of their choice, they're much more likely to be able to work effectively. They can take breaks when they want to. There are less interruptions, and there's all sorts of statistics showing that people increase productivity. Some of that's very objectively measured. An awful lot of it is subjective. People say, "I feel I am more productive. I know I get more done when I take stuff home," and so on. And also, there's a clear benefit in terms of recruiting and retaining people with skills. As we come out of the recession, we have more scarce skills potentially, and we're going to need to make sure, particularly, we can attract the younger, brighter workforce. And to do that, organizations will have to be more agile and adapt their working practices to the expectations of tomorrow's workforce. And part of that involves a real culture change. No longer will people be happy with the old command and control, top-down kind of management culture. We're now looking at wanting organizations that thetrust people, empower people, give them some autonomy, allow them some control over their working lives, treating them like adults, allowing them to choose when, where, and how they get their job done. Who knows best how to do the job? Quite often it's the individual themselves rather than necessarily the manager. And if we give people that choice, particularly now we're talking about remote working today, employees, the vast majority, probably 98% of them, respond very positively. It's always a worry from managers that maybe people will end up spending all day watching television and not working. And of course, what actually happens is sometimes the opposite. People don't turn off from work and work hard. And generally, people appreciate the freedom they're given and the responsibility and react very positively. But there are some management challenges in trying to get the remote working implemented, and where managers struggle a bit is over things like, how do I communicate with my people? I can't see them anymore in the sense that they are sitting at a desk outside my office. How do I know they're working? The answer to that, of course, is, well, how do you know they're working just because they're sitting at a desk looking busy? And how do I communicate with my people? And there are challenges there. Using technology like this is one way of making sure that people who are working remotely still get contact, and also making sure that people work effectively as a team. Most people need to work in conjunction with colleagues of some sort. Well, to do that, they actually need to be in some organized way of socializing with each other, enjoying each other's company. And you can't now rely on kind of teamwork by accident because people happen to be sitting in the same office next to each other. There are, you know, you need to have teamwork by design. So there are times when people still need to get together, but also there are social media tools and other ways of engendering teamwork using today's technology. And of course, one of the key management challenges is being able to measure people by results, not by the time they're putting in, not by them looking busy, not by them staying later in the office to impress you. Managers need to be able to understand what the objectives are for an individual, what they're likely to achieve, and to be able to measure and reward them on getting work done, not just being busy, not just hours of input. In fact, the smart employee is the one who can get the job done in the shortest hours. And so we kind of almost reversing that long hours culture that we've had with office-based work in lots of sectors. Even things like the finance and banking sector that has been renowned for sort of excessively long hours is now turning around and looking more at kind of remote working and new and ways of actually recognizing that what's important is people achieving their goals, not just looking busy for long hours. And then finally, and for today, probably most importantly, how do we get the employees to have the skills that they need, both in their current job and their profession, the things they might have learned from sitting next to other employees, but also what extra skills they need in order to be able to work in this new way. Some of it is fairly natural for the younger generation, but there are now things that we can look at, attributes that the remote employee needs, which kind of very neatly brings me on to introduce Richard, who's obviously going to talk much more about the 7 attributes of an effective remote worker. And just a quick word of introduction for Richard. He and I worked together 25 plus years ago now for a company long gone called Digital Equipment Corporation, which was one of the leaders in remote working in the kind of the years around.
Good evening, everyone, wherever you are at the moment. As Pete indicated, the focus of this webinar is on remote working and specifically the attributes for effectiveness as a remote worker. Just about a bit about me as we get started. I've worked in different aspects of human resource management for my career, and for the last 25 years, specifically in the area of learning and development, and I'm an occupational psychologist. I have a long involvement in flexible working and have been involved in a number of projects around the implementation and management of flexible working and remote working practices. And I must admit up front, I've been a remote worker myself for the last 20 years and quickly own up to the fact that I'm not a natural at it and I really do have to work at it continually. Before I start, could I just ask you to just pause for a moment and think about what it is that prompted you to join this webinar? And then as we go through, you can raise questions in relation to what it was that you were looking to do. Flexible working practices, as Pete indicated, are on the increase. There are many drivers of this trend: cost reduction, search for savings in fuel and transport costs, real estate costs, moving out of large, expensive buildings. Also, in the UK particularly, recent legislation has really now provided potential opportunity for people to really look for flexible working. And also, as Peter mentioned, there's a whole shift in people's lifestyles, and people are looking for more flexibility and balance in their lives. Remote working is one of the main options that is being explored, and it really does make sense to manage and implement it effectively in order to maximize the benefits that Peter referred to, but also to minimize the risk. This webinar is not about the theory or philosophy of what these attributes are. Having been at the cutting edge of HR for many years, I understand the need that at some point one needs to get beyond the big ideas and actually get down to the practical realities. So my agenda is a bit of background. We'll look at the challenges facing remote workers because these really have determined what these attributes are. And then I raise a bigger question of anything else, that is looking at the bigger picture. And then I'll conclude with some ideas about moving into practice. So in terms of background, a few years ago, I was on a project, and the question arose as to what kind of person will be successful as a remote worker. In my search for an answer, I looked at case studies, various opinions, presentations, articles, and what I discovered was quite a lot of similarity, but also some differences. And the main point about it was that nobody had really, I could not find a complete picture, something that was comprehensive and something that had been developed systematically. So that is really what prompted me to do the research. What I then did was develop a model, and my aims there were to provide a more comprehensive answer as a basis for practical tools. It was the application that I was interested. Uh, Very briefly, the method I took for those interested was a competency development approach involving different types of interviews, questionnaires, workshops, and also gaining the experiences and opinions of various sources. These included remote workers, managers of remote workers, organizations involved in remote working, professional organizations like the CIPD and USA Personnel Management, and also reports from organizations like IDS, and obviously also writers in this field. What I then did was integrate the findings and identified the 7 attributes. As I mentioned, as I developed this material and refined it, certain challenges came up. And this is not surprising because working away from the office is really very different to working in one. And each of these differences have important implications and provide potential challenges to the remote workers. And these are factors that remote workers need to take into account and need to prepare for. Here are examples of some of the key ones. So the first point is about working alone and being self-sufficient. Um, this can be an issue for people where this has not necessarily been expected of them in the past, and this is especially important when they have been managed closely on a day-to-day basis. So the whole idea of being alone and being self-sufficient becomes quite an issue. A lot of people in the work research I did reported around feeling lonely and isolated. And the important point here is that they lose a sense of belonging to something. So therefore what is needed are creative ways of finding ways to communicate and remain part of the team. Connected to this but different is the idea of being out of sight and out of mind. And the key point here is that people felt that not being in the office could in some way inhibit or retard their careers because they were not in mind and present when decisions around projects and so on were being made. So once again, this needs to be overcome. Continuous technology, innovation and change, Peter referred back to that, and there's something about being up to date which is a vital component of this. Blurring of homework boundaries came up quite frequently. This is something that needs to be looked at because many people reported the fact that because they were at home, it wasn't necessarily understood by their families that they were actually at work. Therefore, creating these boundaries and negotiating them with one's family is important. And lastly, there's this idea of dealing with the transition. As we all know, any change results in a period of adjustment, and it's no different for the move from office-based work to remote-based work. And I'll come back to this later because it really does need a different skill and a different mindset. All these factors can have a detrimental effect on morale, productivity, relationships, customer satisfaction, and these are good reasons to preempt them and minimize the impact. What is required in remote working is a different mindset and in order to be effective. Moving on then to the 7 attributes. As I mentioned, I integrate all the work I did in the research and brought it down to 7 key attributes. In this context, I'm defining attribute as personal qualities and characteristics, and these once again are described in terms of knowledge, i.e. what somebody knows, skill, what they can do, attitudes, their approach or their frame of mind in a situation, which all gets demonstrated and revealed through their behavior. And by behavior, I mean what they say or what they do in a certain situation. So if we look at our friend Sam on the right, he's the blue one. Uh, what we can see there is Sam and his friend on the seesaw, and the seesaw's apparently going up and down. Sam has some knowledge of levers. He has some skill in being able to move the seesaw. And from here it looks as if his attitude does seem a bit dicey. I mean, the giveaway is his left eyebrow. And certainly his companion doesn't seem at all happy. What we're doing here is focusing on the behavior itself. The key point from a very practical point of view is that behavior can be changed and developed. So as human beings, we all have this capacity for making choices and making changes. So my point is that with this awareness of the impact of our behavior, i.e. whether it's effective or not, we can change it if we have the will to do so. And I'm afraid in our picture there, Sam has decided not to play ball. The 7 attributes model, there are 7 of the attributes moving round from self-motivation on the top all the way around. The first 3, as you can see, are all concerned with self and aspects of how one manages oneself in different situations: self-motivation, self-management, and self-confidence. There are 2 relating to relationships and dealing with others: relationship management, client-customer focus. And there's 1 on problem solving and 1 on continuous development. A quick description of each of these. So in self-management, what we're talking about is being able to take responsibility. It's about being committed and being self-starting and sustaining your effectiveness. There are many distractions in the workplace, and particularly when you're working at home, there are distractions you can make for yourself and other distractions from people around you. So being aware of this and being able to take action in order to sustain your effectiveness is really important, and that's this point about self-motivation. Self-management, it's about being clear about things like your job goals, being organized, being planned and systematic, and being able to adapt to changes as they come up. I'll come back to this one later because it's a really important one. The third one is around self-confidence. This is about believing in your abilities and projecting confidence in the way you interact with others. And this is particularly important because the person working remotely very often has to work with independence, act independently, and make decisions. But also they need to be able to speak up when things are not working. They need to have the confidence to escalate problems when they come up. Timidity is really just not helpful. So those are the 3 self-management areas. The next one is around relationship management, and this is about actively building one's relationships and maintaining them on an ongoing basis. An aspect of this that's particularly important for remote workers is that of being able to develop your support network, because no longer do you have that day-to-day contact, face-to-face contact in the office where you can get help and support from others around you. So you need to take other steps to do this outside of that. Client customer focus. This is something that remote workers need to be vigilant of, particularly if their jobs have a very strong client customer dimension to it. And putting some sort of system in place in order to sustain this becomes really important. Problem solving focus, recognizing, diagnosing, and solving problems. This is really important because across the desk of the remote worker every day will come loads and loads of mails, emails, spam. They really need the capability of being able to sift through this, identify what is important, being able to prioritize, and then also being able to take action on what it is that they have come up with. And this combines then, for example, with the self-confidence to be able to go away and work with it and do something with that independently. And of course, to be able to escalate and have the confidence to escalate. And finally, there's the continuous improvement focus. This is all about commitment to ongoing personal and professional development and improvement. This is important for everyone, but I think particularly so in relation to the remote workers. The key point here is that remote workers really need to take personal responsibility for ensuring this. It's something that can be neglected. And in the world of work today, it's really important to sustain one's value to the marketplace in terms of one's skills, one's knowledge, one's capabilities. So that is why that is there. In summary, these are all described in behavioral terms, and as I said a bit earlier, these can all be developed. My next question then is what else? In the index, in the agenda slide, I had the 7 attributes and I had a little plus for those who might have noticed that. The plus was that there is something else that one needs in terms of one's remote working in order to be effective and ultimately successful. And what my research showed there was that people were very often talking about this whole question of job performance as a key factor. What they were saying was that successful remote workers are good at their jobs. They usually meet or exceed their job goals. This might sound like a very obvious point, but it is something that does need to be taken into account. And this means right up in a very practical ways when people are being selected or considered for remote working, their performance record needs to be looked at, their job performance, their assessments, and also take practical steps to put in any remedial development that might be that might be helpful, and also to monitor this, but most importantly to set job goals for them as they move into remote working. I said I'd come back to this. The point is that as they go into remote working, if they have clarity around what their objectives and goals are going to be, that would be very helpful in terms of getting to a point around their job performance where they are delivering what it is that you require. And also, as a subtext to that, you're also then developing relationship and trust with them through this process of getting clear. The other one is around technology competence, and being competent in using the technology you need is key to effectiveness. So those are the 2 additional ones. So what we're talking about here is the 7 attributes plus job performance and technology competence, a formula for effectiveness as a remote worker. However, during the information gathering stage, it became clear to me that for remote workers to be successful, there were really important implications for the organization as a whole as well, and for each manager. And this is something that's really important. Firstly, there's the question of change. As I mentioned earlier, from the remote workers' point of view, Any change for them will represent a whole sequence of reactions and responses, and this can result in a dip in their performance and in their self-confidence and so on. So putting in place mechanisms to support the remote worker is really important, and this is where the management role comes in. But in addition to that, it's important to implement any necessary policies, procedures, systems to support this way of working. That's a much bigger topic in its own right, but it's all part of planning for preparing and implementing this as a change. Technology is another factor in this big picture that needs to be looked at very carefully. While technology, on the one hand, creates the potential for endless possibilities in the world of flexible working, a consistent message from the technology companies has been that the extent to which the technology will be successfully used and really realize its full potential is only limited by the extent to which the users, i.e., the remote workers, actually take it on board, master it, and then can use it to its full benefit. So really, to get the full return on your investment in technology, it's really important to ensure that people are equipped to do so through the necessary training and development. And the third one, in terms of larger organizational context, is this whole question of culture that Peter referred to earlier. In their book, Peter and Alison propose and explore an invaluable framework for doing for implementing and developing a culture for this new world of work. They refer to the 5 trust principles. I'd like to refer to these briefly as an important factor that the organization needs to look into. The first aspect is around trusting your people. The point here is that the old command and control style of management is no longer appropriate when people work remotely, and they need to be encouraged to be self-managing and self-directed. So building and sustaining trust in order to do this becomes really vital. The second one that Peter mentioned as well was around rewarding results rather than rewarding people for the number of hours they spend in the office, or for the amount of time it takes them to complete a piece of work. Understand the business case. Remote working really does need leadership with a strong vision, with clarity around the business case for implementing remote working. This is a key ingredient, as Peter and Alison say, for creating a culture of trust and a sense of common commitment, because you really do need people to be committed, people who are working at home or in other remote places, to be committed to the cause, and through being clear about your business case, that is a way of enabling that. Starting at the top is really important. This is about senior management taking a lead in being role models for this way of working by encouraging the attitudes and the behaviors that are needed for it to be successful. But they also need to be motivated to drive this as a change. And finally, it's about treating people as individuals, and this means working with people to develop their capability. That's one of the key dimensions, with really tuning into their individual needs, and building them in terms of their ability to take on and be highly self-sufficient and self-management. And in this respect, the 7 attributes are a helpful tool for doing that. I have a quote here that I'd just like to read. It's not very long. It's from the 2014 KPMG Future of Work Survey of Business Leaders. It showed that the top challenge to remote working becoming mainstream is the loss of management control. So loss of management control is what is holding this initiative back. A perceived decline in productivity and loss of employee cohesion, as well as plain tradition, means the employment landscape still revolves around ever bigger centrally located offices and the infrastructure that goes with that. But, they say, the growing costs of operating in this way for employers and employees means that within the next few years, organizations may well be more motivated to rethink their employment model in order to gain competitive advantage. Okay, so that's what the survey says. Still quite a lot of resistance about this whole way of working. Question though is, what does Generation Y, what does the new up and coming generation want? And what they report there is a high level of interest in working from home. However, almost 60% are concerned about the negative perception, and almost 37% perceived lack of trust from superiors and colleagues as a really key issue. So there's a clear challenge here, and the challenge is that employees seem to want it. The business drivers I mentioned, and the ones that Peter mentioned as well, are certainly promoting the case for it. There's evidence of productivity gains that one can get from it, which suggests that it's a good idea. But many managers can't or won't let go. Trust is clearly one of the key issues that is holding many back. This is an issue for the whole organization and really needs to be addressed at all levels. Stephen M.R. Covey, he's the son of the other Stephen Covey, and Rebecca Merrill offer a useful way of looking at this. They differentiate in their book, The Speed of Trust, 5 waves of trust. They talk about self-trust, confidence in ourselves, relationship trust, trust in others, organizational trust, leaders creating trust, market trust, that is about reputation to the external stakeholders, and societal trust, creating value for others. So through this model, one can see that one can actually then go about developing trust in very practical ways at 3 different levels. Must say though, just looking at market trust, reputation, and societal trust, if you just think about the headlines this week, certainly in the United Kingdom, and over the last few years, at the volumes of issues and situations that have arisen where there has been a breakdown in, resulting in a breakdown in trust. And if one then thinks about the potential cost of that in terms of money, in terms of distress, and so on, I don't think one could actually calculate that both. So this whole business of trust is quite a fragile one and can have significant implications and consequences. Finally, a few minutes on looking at ideas into practice. At the beginning, I said that what lay behind all this was getting to a point where we could actually do something in practice to build up this required culture. In a nutshell, the challenge for managers and organizations is to build this environment that will allow the remote working to thrive, and incorporating practical ways of building trust and relationships at the different levels. So an approach could be, for example, to develop the remote workers who are effective, motivated, top of their game, equip managers with tools and processes so they feel confident to let go. And I think that's a really important thing, because a lot of the reporting was saying that managers don't feel comfortable in letting go, so that they can support, manage, and develop the individuals. And also at the organizational level, providing a framework for building strong and trusting relationships. The toolkit that I have developed has tried to address these different components, and I use it as an example just to illustrate how one could go about doing that. So one part of the toolkit is what I've called the Effective Remote Worker Profile and Workbook. It contains the profile, the 7 attributes, job performance and technology competence. What I've included there are templates and tools to assess, interpret, and plan improvement, and tips and tools for developing the attributes. So what you get there is the profile itself, which is a self-assessed, and then individuals work through it. The aim is to give clarity, confidence, help them build relationships with their managers. This sort of workbook, the individual can work through them themselves, better still to work with their manager, and even possibly to attend a group workshop, which is one of the options. An associated tool is a booklet I've produced, where an individual can get feedback, have somebody assess them on the 7 attributes, and this acts as a really useful outside view of their capability, and that's an option tool that could be used. And finally, there's the facilitator guide, and here are guidelines for using the tool, the profile on a one-to-one basis with sort of coaching notes and coaching guidance, and detailed facilitation notes for running an optional half-day workshop. Sample copies of the documents are also included. And the whole idea of this is to help managers prepare, manage and support remote workers and build relationship. So ideally, what I hope you've got in this webinar is some understanding of what is needed to be a remote worker and how to be successful as a remote worker. And to be successful is more than being effective. It's actually the manager, organizational support and infrastructure that needs to be put in place as well. And with that, then, it's the question of the important role of managers and the organization as a whole. Hopefully, you'll also have some idea as to how this can be achieved in practice through all parts working in partnership. Thank you for joining, and good luck in your remote working venture. Thank you, Peter.
Right, very pleased to join Richard back again, and we're going to start the Q&A session. We've got about 15 minutes to go of our hour. And so what we're really interested in is obviously if there are now any questions from people. We've had a couple come in already. Do type some more into your Q&A block at the bottom of the screen. And the first one that we have is, do you feel that managers are ready for the change that's happening? I'll start with that. A simple answer, I think, is no. It's amazing because even younger managers who you might think they're typically Generation X, even coming on Generation Y now, you might think are more ready for managing in an agile environment because they're part of the generation that understand the technology and so on. But they equally struggle with remote working because I guess a new manager thinks, well, what's managing about? Oh, it's about controlling people. I have responsibility for the activities of my people, therefore I have to control them. And they tend to default into being able to kind of stand over them and see them. And it takes a level of maturity to be prepared to let go and delegate, and as both Richard and I have said, trust employees. So there's an interesting scenario that says that managers still need to learn. No, I mean, trusting you can argue is a kind of human nature. I'll ask for Richard to comment on this in a second. But the real question is, do managers naturally start to trust, or do they need development? And my personal view is that they need some development. Richard, what's your view?
I agree with you, Peter. I also think that one can overcomplicate it as well, and I think it's really important to sort of break these down to some really basic components, some really fundamental components, and give managers support in being able to relate in that way. Because ultimately, what we're talking about is sort of the quality of interaction between people and doing what one would normally do. So I'm sure there's a risk that one can make too much
Interesting
of it as well.
question has come in also about when you're recruiting people to do remote working, how do you effectively assess candidates who have no remote working experience? And there was another question
Yeah.
about, is there a particular personality type that is able to adapt to remote working better than others? I don't think there's exactly a psychometric test, is there, Richard, that does that? But are there people particular sorts of people who adapt better to remote working, and is there a way of detecting that at interview, I guess, or selection process? What do you think, Richard?
Right. At this stage, I certainly haven't come across any psychometric that predicts specifically in relation to remote working. Um, and that's why if one looks at the attributes, that is certainly a start point. So there's no reason why one couldn't develop a series of behavioral based interviews uh, which aim to get some understanding of the extent to which individuals have been able to demonstrate their capability in relation to the attributes by giving examples from previous work experience. So this would be the sort of the criterion-based interview, sort of the targeted selection type of approach to things, using the attributes in that way. So if one just uses an example, take this, one of the attributes, continuous development, one could quite easily frame questions to get an understanding of the extent to which people have taken responsibility for their own personal development. Similarly, in areas of self-management, all of them actually lend themselves to it. But I've not come across that. With regard to whether there's a sort of a predominant personality, I just don't know, to be quite honest, because in some regards, the convenient answer convenient question some people raise is that of, well, what about introverts versus extroverts? Send the introverts home and leave the extroverts in the office. But it's really not as simple as that. Because extroversion and introversion is more around how one uses one's energy. If you use the Myers-Briggs type definitions of introversion and extroversion, and many introverts really do need the social contact, whereas extroverts are happy to work at home, put their heads down, and then go to the squash court afterwards and find their social interaction so well. So it's just not as simple as a personality attribute, a personality dimension, and I haven't found
Okay, we have
anything
another question
that's been
about is there
satisfactory.
an ideal balance between time at home and time at work? So some days per week at home, some days a week in the office. I guess my take on that is that all of the time at home or all of the time at the office is not right, but any combination within that to suit the individual and the job works. And I think for many jobs, it's possible to take some of the tasks which clearly can be done individually on your own without having to be in a meeting or face to face with other people, and can be done better probably at home away from the interruptions of the office, on the assumption that home, of course, is a place without interruptions. Some people go out to work to get away from their partner, the screaming kids, the pets, the neighbours, or whatever the interruption happens to be. But for most people, there's a balance of what is being more and more called the kind of activity-based workplace. So architects designing offices now are saying, well, people don't want to sit at a desk to do all their work. Sometimes they're in meetings, sometimes they're in informal discussions and so on. And the workspace needs to reflect the activity they're carrying out at that time. And I think it's the same with home. There's some activities that are better done from home, some better done in a busy office, maybe some certainly better done in a more formal meeting room surroundings. There tends to be people who end up with a balance of 2 or 3 days in the office and 2 or 3 days at home, depending, and particularly people who have childcare or other specific commitments to have to work a timetable around. They might have Monday and Friday at home, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, kind of thing, and that seems to work for a lot of people. But there is no ideal. It obviously is highly dependent on job content and the personal circumstances of the individual. Richard, what do you think?
Mhm. I would just add then, in addition to what you just said, it's the actual temperament of the individual themselves as well. Uh, so clearly, as you said, in different circumstances, depending on the job, the demands of the job, the requirements of the job will determine the extent to which they're at home or in the office. But the extent to which somebody is able to work alone will also depend on what kind of person they are, and that when it comes back to really focusing on being aware of what it is that will help them to be more effective and actually to develop in areas where and put in place activity to compensate for maybe what they've lost in the workplace in order to
Yeah, we just
remain
had
as
an
effective
interesting comment in
as they possibly can.
from one participant saying, do we think that managers should spend a certain amount of time themselves working from home to experience it, to know what it's like? And I think that to me is a very good idea. I think what happens, I find a lot of organizations is senior managers saying, yes, of course we agree with flexibility, and of course will allow people to work from home, but us important directors have to be in the office all the time, of course, because we have to be available, and we have to work long hours because that's just the nature of the job. But it's okay for other people to work more flexibly. Implication being that if you want to get on in this organization, then you have to work more flexibly. No, you don't work flexibly. You actually have to work long hours and have to be somebody who is dedicated to the job by showing that you kind of are not a flexible worker, not wanting to work at home. So that is a particular problem. We seem to have lost Richard somewhere along the way, so I don't know if you can still hear us. If you can rejoin us, that would be good, Richard. Um, Meanwhile, we've got a few minutes to go. So another questions come in around would we recommend a certain amount of face-to-face contact? And I think that there is a problem with isolation if people working remotely all the time. And hence, I think this idea of spending some days in the office versus some days at home is useful. Welcome back, Richard. You've rejoined us. And I think, but I think we overdo the importance of face-to-face contact. I think a lot of people have a tradition of spending a lot of time sitting around a meeting table just exchanging information, which could more easily be done through an exchange of emails or reports, or even maybe a phone call if it has to be interactive. And I also think we underestimate the social media facilities that we have, the internal versions of Facebook and so on, like Yammer is an example of something that's being used quite a lot by organizations, where the younger generation are now very happy to not just exchange formal business information, but socialize remotely over the internet. And therefore, they still need a bit of face-to-face contact, but not nearly as much as let's say our previous generation. Richard, do you have a view on amount of face-to-face contact people should have or need to have? I've got one question that's come in, which I'll just deal with in the last minute that we have, which of course is: are the lack of digital skills also a cause for concern? I think that might be slightly tongue in cheek, given that we've just had a slight digital hiccup here. Um, yes, I think there is. I think the we can easily assume that the younger generation just understand this stuff, and of course they do, and they adapt to it much more easily than an older generation. But this is one of the generation gaps where you've got managers who came up in essentially a non-digital world, managing people who've come up in a digital one, and so there's almost a reverse mentoring process that needs to happen, which is the Generation Ys, the millennials coming through, who kind of just understand this technology, are able to kind of hold the hands of the slightly older generation who are not so familiar with it. But it interests me when you think it looks like the sort of technology we're using now, obviously is still subject to problems like poor broadband connections. and so sometimes the things sort of fall over. Richard disappears and reappears, and there's a danger that if somebody has a bad experience of using this sort of technology, that they end up deciding not to continue with it. Yet you find a lot of people using things like Skype in their personal life, even if they don't use video meetings or conferencing in their professional life. Richard, I think we can hear you and see you, so we're coming up to 1 o'clock. Do you have a kind of a last farewell summary comment for everybody?
No, I would just like to finish the sentence I started before I disappeared, and somebody had asked the question
Okay.
about how frequently one should actually see or be with people, as opposed to being remotely and working over the technology. I worked with a group recently, and there was the manager and a team of about 8 people all working remotely, and they hadn't actually seen each other for a long, long time, and they came back together for a day to go through the stuff I've got through my toolkit. And what they really, really valued from the day was also the idea of getting together and getting to know each other. It was almost as if they'd taken a tonic and they had been able to re-establish relationship, and that gave them strength to go away. But it also meant that they'd learned to know each other a bit better, and that was, they thought, enormously important. So I think one needs to get the balance really in perspective here.
Okay, that's brilliant. That's a great point on which to stop. Thank you very much, Richard, for your insights. There on your screens are contacts for Richard and myself, and the website for my book and my personal website. So thank you all of you for your contributions. Thank you for your questions, and good luck in implementing remote working in your organizations. Bye for now.